I'm Jennifer Crumpton, and today on Sartor TV, we're learning from author Michael Mauboussin. Michael's the managing director and head of global financial strategies at Credit Suisse. He's an adjunct professor of finance at Columbia Business School and the author of The Success Equation, Untangling Skill and Luck in Business, Sports, and Investing. You tell a story in your book about how you got your first job. Can you share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a senior in college. I have no idea what I want to do with my life. One of the companies that came to recruit on campus was Drexel Burnham, a very hot investment bank at the time. I did sufficiently well on my interviews on campus, which is in Washington, D.C., to get invited to New York, right? So I get my very best suit, I polish my shoes. We meet around a table and I go, here's the deal. You're going to have 6 interviews with various people in the training program, and then you're going to get 10 minutes with a head guy. Right, so I go through my 6 interviews, fine. I get my 10 minutes, get ushered in this guy's big, beautiful office, and I see peeking out from underneath his desk a trash can of the Washington Redskins. Now I was going to school in Washington, I'd gone to a couple of games, I'm a fan, so I go, hey, great trash can. And this hits the guy in the emotional seat, right? He goes on about how great sports are and how great Washington is, and sports a metaphor for life, and this 10-minute interview becomes 15 minutes of me basically going like this and listening to this guy go on and on. So I go back to school, get the coveted letter in the mail, you've got the job, great. So I start my job, all's good. And about 3 months into the training program, one of the senior guys pulls me aside, kind of puts his arm around me and says, kid, you're doing okay, but I have to tell you something. The 6 people you interviewed with voted against hiring you. They said, but the head guy came in and overrode them and insisted we hired you. So I don't know what you said to him, but it was really, really effective. So as I like to say, my career was launched by a trash can, and that was pure luck.
Since that stroke of luck that you had, what is it that has made you so successful in your career?
Well, I think there's been a lot of luck in my career as well. But some of the key ingredients has been finding something that I was really interested in. That same training program had us rotate through 20 different departments, allowed me to really assess what my skills were good for, what I found myself interested in, and that allowed me to sort of find a niche of a job that really suited me well. And then I had to really work hard. And then finally, and probably most importantly, a couple great mentors and a few people along the way who allowed me to sort of do a little bit, work off the beaten path. And that's allowed me to develop and grow in ways that I might not have been otherwise able to do. So those are sort of the ingredients, a lot of luck, some great folks, and being able to find something I really found enjoyable.
I hear that you only took 1 business class in college. How did you decide to go into the financial industry? What happened?
So Jennifer, true confession, by the way, I got a C in that class, barely passed.
It's an exclusive.
It's exclusive, exactly. No, so I knew obviously I needed a job, and this training program I thought made a lot of sense. Obviously finance was a pretty interesting area, but the key was I felt I was going to get a lot of exposure to various areas in a firm. And by the way, in many ways, being a liberal arts major and not having specific business training was actually an asset because it forced me to ask a lot of fundamental questions about how things work. So, I sort of fell into it a little bit. I knew it was a 1.5-year training program, and I knew I'd learn a ton as I was doing that. Didn't know exactly that's what I wanted to do, but it seemed like a reasonable step that was a good transition for me out of school.
You were speaking about mentors. What role have mentors played in your life?
I think it's been tremendous for me, and there are a couple people I would mention in particular. The first, as I mentioned, I was a liberal arts major, and I was really very confused when I came into the financial community, but I picked up a book in the late 1980s called Creating Shareholder Value by a guy named Al Rappaport, who ended up being my mentor, and to this day is still a very dear friend. And Rappaport really laid out some key ways to think about investing and business and the world. And as I met him, I remember the first time I met him was 1991. It was one of those really, awe-inspiring moments for me. But we eventually ended up working together. We actually wrote a book together. And through these many years, it's been extraordinarily helpful to have someone to bounce ideas off of, someone to give me guidance when I needed it. Just really, really helpful. The second guy is Bill Miller, who I worked with at Legg Mason Capital Management. And Bill's one of these guys who's really an expansive thinker, reads really, really widely, and very much encouraged me to think about things in somewhat non-traditional ways and cross-disciplinary ways. And again, having that encouragement at key moments was really, really helpful. So those are 2 people that really helped me in my development and almost indulged my interest and sparked my interests.
You have 2 sons in college, and you teach at Columbia Business School. So what advice do you have for young people, millennials, who want to rise to the top, but they're going out into a really tough job market?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think a lot about this. There are probably a few things I would say. The first is to really try to take an inventory of your own skills and interests and look into the world and say, where do my skills match up with where the needs are in the world? So, taking a little bit of time to thinking about what you like to do, what you think you're good at, and where those skills might be applicable. The second thing, which I tell my students and my kids, is there are a couple things that are really, really valuable. One is your integrity, and second is your mind. And those are both things you have to keep working on developing all the time and never, never shortchange them, right? So constant learning, constant thinking, and improving. And the third element, which we can never get away from, is just plain hard work. Hard work is really, really essential. No matter what field you go in, you look at the very best performers, those are people who have been dedicated and hardworking. So those are probably three things I would say for advice for people.
What are some of the proudest moments in your personal life and your business life?
Yeah. So in the personal life, it has to be my family, and in particular, my wife, and getting married. Now we're working on 25 years, not quite there yet. But I do think that a life partner is an extraordinarily important choice that creates an enormous amount of positive, in some cases negative leverage, and for me it's been an extraordinarily positive leverage. And so through that we've had 5 great kids, and watching them grow up, it's been a real great, so much fun and it's so exciting. It's not always easy, some days are challenging, but that I think by far has been my thing I'm most proud of personally.
What about in your business life?
In business, I think that I've been so happy to be able to do things that I really find interesting. So I think a lot of people go to work and maybe they're not so psyched about what they do, but I'm one of those guys who gets to go to work and really do things I love to do every single day. And again, there was hard work in getting there, but that I think is the most important thing. And when I think about my job and my work, the way I think about it is it's constant learning and constant teaching. And both that component of learning and teaching combined really make it interesting, never-ending challenges, and just an enormous amount of fun.
Speaking of fulfillment, what do you like to do in your personal time off that keeps you balanced and happy?
Well, I'm a big sports fan, so I certainly like to watch and participate in sports. So I still play a little bit of ice hockey, and I like to watch it on TV. And really the other thing is reading. So I love to read and constantly read. And then the last thing is traveling. I just find traveling to new parts of the world really fun, exciting, and interesting. So those are the 3 big ones for me. It's sports, it's reading, and it's traveling.
In your position of managing director and head of global financial strategies at Credit Suisse, you have worked with some of the best and the brightest. What do you think makes a good leader?
That's a really interesting and tough question, but for me, what our great leaders are about is instilling the notion of intrinsic motivation in the people they work with. And for me, intrinsic motivation tends to have 3 specific components. The first is a sense of autonomy. So not that people are working by themselves, but people have some flexibility in their own work environments to figure out how to do things most effectively. That really, I think, is encouraging for people. The second is mastery, the sense of the people that you're working with, that they're improving. They feel that they're improving. They're learning. They're getting better. They're never going to get there perfectly, but they're moving in the right direction. And the last thing I think probably most essential is a sense of purpose, right? And that emanates from values. But why are we here? What are we doing? Something bigger than ourselves. When you get those 3 components together in an organization through a leader, I think that's what really gets people motivated, people get fired up, and that's what keeps them coming back. So to me, that's what I usually look for in a leader, is that those elements, and in particular that notion or that sense of purpose.
You have led financial strategy during one of the toughest recessions in history. How do you lead differently during crisis?
I think the biggest thing is to keep a level head throughout all times. And I think that's hard for people to do, especially things like markets. There tends to be euphoria and there tends to be massive fear. And the key is to try to take out the peaks and valleys and keep things very steady. So, I deal a lot in financial markets, and that means when things are going really well, you have to sort of say to people, hey, it's not going to keep going, be mindful that we should expect more normal times in the future. And likewise, when everyone's despondent, say, hey, no, things are going to get better. So I think, to me, trying to keep people on the level, trying to be rational and thoughtful, and try to avoid those peaks and valleys, which are sort of natural, but need to be managed.
Why did you write The Success Equation, and why is it important right now in particular?
So the reason I wrote it is that I'd read a lot about randomness and luck. I think a lot of us had, but I really hadn't seen anything that was quantifying the actual impact of luck on things. So I really wanted to take the concept and make it much more operational for people sort of in day-to-day life. So that was the real motivation. Now, it's a really interesting question as to why it's relevant. I mean, I guess it's always relevant, right? But why so much relevance today? And part of it is, it's going to sound a little bit backwards, but part of it is, in many cases, skill today has never been higher, say, for example, in athletics, but it turns out the differences in skills in the very best players is smaller than it's ever been, which means more is being left to luck. So in other words, our world today has more luck in it than it has in generations past. So while this has always been an interesting topic and always a relevant topic, it actually may be a bigger topic today than it has been in the past. So that was another key motivating thing, is that this is actually a really big deal for people in general.
What's the central theme or thesis of the book?
Yeah, the way to think about it is that there's, we like to say the continuum of luck and skill. So on one side, you might think of activities that are all luck, no skill, maybe, lotteries or roulette wheels. And the other side, pure skill, no luck, maybe, a running race or something like that. And that most of life's activities are somewhere between these two extremes. And the point is, if you know where you are in that continuum, it gives you enormous amounts of information about how to think about it, how to approach the problem, and how to understand what's happened in the past. So that's the basic idea, is that knowing where you are gives you all sorts of insights about how to think about what's happened, what's going on today, and to anticipate the future.
Why is it that people are so bad at distinguishing outcomes based on skill from luck? And why is it important for business leaders to actually understand this and adjust for it?
So Jennifer, this is one of the coolest things. I think this is so interesting. It turns out neuroscientists have studied people's brains, and it turns out in our left hemispheres, all of us, there's a part of your brain they call the interpreter. And this interpreter, basically you give it any effect and it comes up with a cause to explain it, right? So you basically say, here's what happened, and your mind, all of our minds, create a story to explain what's happened. Now here's the key, the interpreter knows nothing about luck, right? It assumes that good things happen because something good was behind it, and bad things happen because something bad was behind it. So our minds are naturally papering over this issue, a topic of luck, and that I think can lead to some misconstrual of history and not misunderstanding of what's going on. So to me, this is one of the key issues, is understanding that skill and luck thing. Your mind is going to sort of try to create stories to explain it that don't really make any sense. So being aware of that part of your mind, being aware that you're constantly creating stories to explain the world, and then really working against that to understand truly the contributions of skill and luck to make better decisions in the future. So to me, that's it's such an interesting topic. It's so hard for any of us to sidestep it, but it's everywhere you look. I mean, everyone's constantly creating stories to explain the world, and most of them don't make a lot of sense.
Who's your target audience for the book, and how can they benefit from these principles?
So in the subtitle, we talk about the relevance for sports, business, and investing. So I think that would be the broad audience. So if you're a sports fan, for example, or even if you're a general manager of a sports team, or even an athlete, a lot of these concepts are incredibly important for evaluating performance of players and so forth. For business people, it's how do we make decisions? How do we think about good things and bad things? How do we pay people? We want to pay them for skill. We don't want to pay them for luck. How do we do those kinds of things? And of course, the world of investing. There are a lot of money managers. People entrust their futures, their livelihoods to these money managers. How much does the performance of those money managers rely on skill, and how much of it is luck? So those are the three primary audiences. Of course, it could be basically anybody that's in any profession that's going to be relevant for them. But those are the main audiences I want to talk to. And things about sports is probably the easiest, because we have the most data, and the systems, the games pretty much stay the same from year to year. Business and investing a little trickier, but all those three areas I think can benefit from this thinking.
In the book, you discuss the tendency of businesses to build strategic plans based on studying the success of other companies. And you say that this can really be a downfall. Why is that?
Yeah, it seems very logical, right? Like, you want to succeed, go figure out, look at somebody else has succeeded. But there's something called undersampling failure. So let me try to explain it this way. Let's say there's a particular strategy and two companies pursue it. One of them does great, and the other one flames out. It basically goes out of business, right? So now you walk along and you go, I'm gonna think about this strategy. Is it any good? And what do? You see the company that did great, and you failed to see the company that flamed out. So you say, hey, if I do that strategy, I'm likely to succeed as well. So you're undersampling the things that didn't work. So that's one example, is you have to be very careful about learning from history, because the only people you see, or the only companies you see, are the ones that survived and did well, right? You fail to see the ones that didn't do well. So that is a major, major lesson, is being careful about learning from what other companies did, because you're sampling only success and you're missing all the failure.
So Michael, the American dream is that if you work hard, you will succeed. What does your book say about the role of luck and other phenomenon like the path-dependent process or the Matthew effect? And how does it teach readers to accommodate for that in our career planning, our business management, and our general pursuit of the American dream?
Super interesting question. Right? One of the other ways to think about skill and luck is skill would be what's in your control, and luck would be what's out of your control. So one of the things I always say to students and my own kids, right, is focus on what's in your control, and everything else you really can't deal with, right? So focus on what you control. So it turns out in different realms, the role of luck has different significance. So for example, in the social world, so think about books or music or movies, what we know, it's been fairly well documented, there are big social phenomenon behind these things, like fads and fashions, right? You never really can predict what the next big fashion will be, or what song is going to take off, and so on and so forth. So what I always like to say is, in particular realms, you have to be very circumspect about great success, you know, whether it's Star Wars or Harry Potter or something like that, because if you replayed the tape of time again, it's very unlikely those same things would have succeeded in the same way that they did. So to me, if you say, well, what do we do about that? Well, one is, if you're participating in those fields, for example, you're a book publisher, you'd probably want to have a lot of possibilities, so a lot of options. But as an individual trying to live the dream, the only thing you can really do is focus on what you can control, right? And those are things we talked about a few moments ago. It's making sure that you're constantly learning, you're improving your mind, that your integrity is always intact and unassailable, and that you're working really hard. Those are the things that are in your control, your attitude's in your control. And then what's outside your control, you have to be a little bit philosophical about it, you know? Chips fall where they might. Now, if you work really hard, of course, you probably do better than someone who doesn't, but you never really know. And the other thing I'll say on that is that the most successful, by whatever measure you want to say, but many of the very successful, say financially successful people, they really did benefit massively from luck, almost every case. So you just have to you have to realize that they're not sort of superhuman, they're sort of regular people, worked really hard, who really benefited from luck. And so, maybe philosophical, but I think it really helps to think that through and understand what you can control and not control.
What is the arc of skill, and how can organizations and individuals address this?
Super interesting. So, you know, skill's not static, and tends to follow a gentle arc, right? So let's say you're a tennis player. You play when you're a little kid and you're not so good, but you get better as you practice and you get physically stronger. And you get better and better and better. At some point you peak, and then because of age, you kind of come down the other side, right? So this is called the arc of skill. And we can see this very clearly with athletes. For example, athletes typically in some sports peak in their early 20s, mid 20s, for other sports, late 20s for other sports yet. But it also turns out it works cognitively. It turns out a cognitive performance also follows the same arc. So the key is to understand that skill itself is not a static concept. It changes over time. And whether it's an organization or an individual or an athlete, we tend to see the same pattern of improvement followed by degradation.
Can you give us a summary of the art of good guesswork?
Yes, the art of good guesswork. That basically says, understand where you are on the luck skill continuum, understand the ramifications, and then from there, understand how that allows you to understand or anticipate the future, right? So for example, if you're really far on the skill side, then what happened before is likely to happen next. So if I run a sprint against Usain Bolt, he will win. If we run again, he will win again. There's no doubt about that, right? There's no guesswork there. If you're on the far side, on the luck side, you know, for example, playing the lottery, understand if you win, of course, there's no reason to think you're ever going to repeat that. So sort of knowing where you are in that continuum allows you to gain some insight about how you should think about how the future will unfold, and we'll call that guesswork, right? The educated guesswork. I think that's incredibly helpful and in some ways very liberating, right? So you understand that luck really can play a big role, and sometimes you can't do much about it. Sometimes it works for you, sometimes against you, and that's the basic idea.
Michael, you have a history of going against the grain, of research, experts, and promoting unconventional wisdom in your career and your books as well. Why is this important? Why do you do this? And have you gotten pushback in your field? And if so, how have you handled that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I've ever been asked that question just like that before. But I think it's less, to me, it's less about being unconventional, and it's really trying to get to the root of things, right? To really understand the fundamentals. And I think that a lot of things in life, we run around with rules of thumb about how things work. You know, if it's a business or in markets, they're rules of thumb. And you know, what's good about rules of thumb, of course, is they save you a lot of time, right? But what's bad about rules of thumb is they typically have blind spots. So I've always been very interested in understanding what those blind spots are and trying to eradicate them, right? So I really want to get down to the basics. So there are examples like how the stock market works. There's a whole theory of how that works, and it just never made full sense to me. And then other theories, I think, do a much better job of explaining it. It's not mainstream, but I think it's much more descriptive and much more useful for understanding as a metaphor for how things work. So I've always been interested in trying to figure out how things go, how things work. And these rules of thumb sometimes, again, obscure how things work versus really giving us insights. So I've dedicated my life to trying to figure those things out.